until yesterday was the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. He's now pulled out. He's decided that he will be backing Rishi Sunak, and he joins me now to explain. Good to have you on, Secretary of State. You now are supporting the former Chancellor. Why is that? Good morning.
Morning. Because actually, when I looked around the field, I pulled out because actually the rules were changed. They doubled the number of nominations required at the last minute, so I looked around the field of other candidates, and for my money, Rishi has the massive advantage of being able to walk into the job and get on with it on day one. And I think that's going to be incredibly important. We're at a time with multiple challenges, the war in Ukraine, the levels of inflation, the cost of living squeeze. He'll be able to get on with it straight away, and he shares a lot of my views about how we should do that. Tackle inflation, grow the economy, cut taxes. That's what Rishi wants to do, and that's why I'm supporting him.
He's the Chancellor who's just imposed taxes.
No, last week he did the biggest personal.
But we live under the biggest tax take
generation.
for 40 years, which obviously is not solely down to Rishi Sunak, but he was the man with the red box until a few weeks ago.
Sure, but I think we have to recognise we've also just gone through the worst pandemic for 100 years. People understand, and I remember being on your programme many times when we talked about the £411 billion of support, that we provided, and of course that does mean that
10% of which we never found.
Well, I mean, we can go back into all the expenditure. When you say, well, I'm not sure which bit you're talking about, but
we understand around 10% was claimed erroneously by companies that were set up.
Oh, I see that side of things. Yeah. So does
that speak to fiscal responsibility with Mr. Sunak?
Well, I was going to say the furlough scheme, which kept 11.6 million people in their jobs, kept businesses going. Like any scheme, there can be abuse, but those people are being pursued. So I think the figures you're quoting include money which is being recovered and is being pursued. But the point about this is that we had a huge pandemic. Yes, taxes then became high. We saw last week the biggest tax cut worth about £330 to somebody on average salary. That's because we took national insurance, where you start paying tax, and raised it to over £12,500. So that was Rishi doing that. And he says it's not a question of if we have tax cuts, it's a question of when. And I liked that idea that you control inflation. You don't cut taxes and then add to inflation. You control inflation and then do further tax cuts, whilst making sure you bring the overall size of debt down. And I think all those things are sensible. I think he's got a sensible plan. I think he's serious and credible. And that's why I'm backing Rishi for Prime Minister.
Interesting you would use the word control, because you are probably now the Minister for Broadcast. They seem to field you on the darkest days. They put you out there to take the toughest questions. I have to put it to you that using the word control is what I would use for Mr. Sunak yesterday, in which questions were taken only from a small number of journalists, and initially no newspaper journalists were meant to ask questions of Mr. Sunak. He's a control freak, isn't he?
I don't think that's fair at all, actually. I was there, and I've heard one or two people say this. It was supposed to be a Q&A with members. It is, after all, the electorate is members, and I know that obviously...
Why invite the press then?
Well, because the press and the wider public have a very big interest. But just to let you know,
if you invite them, they're going to ask questions. You know what makes for a rather rambunctious press.
Hold on, let me just make sure I correct the record here, then, because anyone listening to you would think that it was all members and no press. In fact, only one member got to ask a question, and the rest of the questions were all from the press. Andy took another one at the end. Andy let a couple of the press come back, ask follow-ups as well. So I think this is a slight guess-up job. It seemed to me that he was answering questions from the press, and in fact only one from a member in the end.
All right. I note that he's enjoyed the support. Ready for Rishi is one Norman Lamont. He was the author of Black Wednesday. That's a shocking endorsement, isn't it, for a former Chancellor?
Well, I mean, in fairness, he has the support of, I think I'm right in saying, 3 former Chancellors, including Clarke, a former leader and Foreign Secretary in William Hague.
And Norman Lamont, the man who gave us Black Wednesday. He gives us a thumbs up for Rishi. He's ready for Rishi. Why should the country be?
Well, you're picking on one of the 3 former Chancellors, I notice. The point is, here is a man who understands what you've got to do is get inflation down, get public finances under control and cut taxes. Now, for me, that is a very central Conservative message that says you stand behind people who are working hard and eventually will get to keep more of that money in their pocket. In fact, this month, because there's the first of those tax cuts takes place now.
Let's move from former Chancellors then to a true Tory grandee, Sir Nicholas Soames. I don't need to remind you about his lineage, Mr. Shapps. Quotes, Sir Nicholas says of your of you that you have more front than Brighton Beach and the patter of a used car salesman. How would you respond to Sir Nicholas Soames?
I wouldn't, actually, because I don't think there's any benefit in politics at all of throwing around insults. If he's got a candidate to back him. I will talk about the candidate that I am going to back, and there we are.
What about this suggestion that Jeremy Hunt, that some of Mr Sunak's colleagues are trying to lend support to Jeremy Hunt so that when we get to the final two, a nation waits and expects with great excitement, it will be that possibly Jeremy Hunt is still in there and Nadine Dorries is suggesting it's a stitch-up?
Well, Jeremy Hunt himself says it's completely untrue. He knows the people who've signed his nomination papers, so I would take Jeremy Hunt's word for this over anybody else's.
Last couple of questions. Nadeem Zahawi, with whom I spoke in the first hour of the show, said that he would certainly offer Boris Johnson a cabinet position if he wanted one and Mr Zahawi were to be PM. Should Rishi Sunak follow the same path?
Well, I was asked the same when I was a leadership candidate. I wouldn't have done, because I'm absolutely certain that Boris Johnson would not wanted a job.
But what about if he phoned you up and he said, I fancy being...
Well, I'll leave that problem to I'll leave that problem to Rishi Sunak if it gets that far. But I have to say, I think most people would believe it was well deserved. He's had 1 or 2 kids whilst he's been down the street. He's had coronavirus. He's gone through the worst pandemic the country's ever seen. He's had the war in Ukraine. I think he deserves a bit of a break if I were him, and I'm not sure that he would want to continue to be in a cabinet for the time being. But I'll leave all that to Rishi. I haven't had that conversation with him.
Final question, very much with your Secretary of State for Transport brief. I understand that a new deal has been put to the rail unions. In some instances, it is being reported that for lower staff, this is offering a 13% pay hike, which is above the level of inflation. How hopeful are you that this could mean that there's peace on our railways?
I don't want to disappoint anyone, but I've seen the deal misreported in some of the early coverage. There is a deal to be done on the railways, but the deal needs to involve getting rid of those working practices from the 1950s and 60s, 70s, which still occur on the railway, to modernise it so that we can actually help to moderate ticket price increases for passengers, run a more efficient railway that, for example, is able to run on a Sunday. We have voluntary working. We don't even have it in the contracts in some cases. So there is a deal to be done. But actually, I did see some details come out about that just before coming in here. And I'm sorry, I haven't had time to study them, but I didn't recognise them, I have to say.
OK, so we're still currently then looking at still very much the threat of industrial action lasting, Mr Shapps.
Well, unfortunately, since I think we last spoke, ASLEF, so that's the train drivers union, have now balloted on 8 of the different railways for action. Just to be clear, the median salary, the average salary for train drivers is nearly £60,000 a year. I'm just not sure that the public is going to be hugely sympathetic to the idea when actually we are around the table, we are talking to them, and they just need to sit down with the employers and get this thing settled. I don't think strike action now is in anybody's benefit.
Grateful for your time. Thanks. Grant Shapps, Secretary of State for Transport, appearing here on LBC. We're at 5 minutes after 9. The news is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.